Welcome. My name is John, and it is my great pleasure to be your host for this segment of the series, Discovering the Principles of Life, the Principles of Creation, Part 1. The content that we are studying comes from the Divine Principle, the Principle of Creation. The Divine Principle is a revelation from God that was given to Reverend Sun Myung Moon. In the previous segment, the introduction, we talked about the three topics that the principle of life cover. The first and most important is the ideal. The second is the fall, which explains how humanity deviated from the ideal. And the third is restoration. Restoration explains the principles by which humanity will be able to restore the ideal that was lost. In this segment, we are going to focus on the ideal itself. What is the ideal that humanity has been striving for? What will it look like when we finally get there? And why is it that all creation, including human beings, have been developing towards this ideal? In order to understand the ideal, a good place to start is to ask the question, where did this ideal come from? To answer this question, we need to ask what or who designed the universe. In other words, we need to know who the Creator is, who is God. It used to be thought by many in the scientific community that the universe was always here. The universe just was, and therefore we didn't need a God, a creator or designer. And so many people did not believe there was a God. But in recent years, science has discovered that the universe, all of time and space, has a beginning. It's called the Big Bang Theory. This means that there is an origin. There is something on the other side of the beginning of time and space, something that is beyond time and space, something that just is, that has no beginning or end, something that caused our universe to be the way it is, to develop as it has towards an ideal, and produce human beings like you and me that are passionate about realizing an ideal in our lives. So the question is no longer, is there a God? If we define God as the origin, the question now becomes, what is the nature of that origin? What is the nature of God? And that's what we're going to explore in this segment. What is the nature of the original being? By discovering the nature of the original being, we will begin to learn more about the ideal that has been designed in the creation and to each of us. To begin with, God, the original being that exists beyond time and space, must be invisible. But if God is invisible, how can we know his nature? The answer is fairly simple. If everything in the universe came from God, then by common sense, if we are able to find the universal principles that all things share in common, we will be able to conclude that such principles originated in God. This is what St. Paul was talking about in the Bible, Romans 1:20. The invisible nature of God has been expressed through the created things which we can see. In other words, we can know the invisible God the same way we know the invisible character of an artist, through his or her works. Or, in the same way, we can know what is going on in a person's invisible mind by observing their outward expression. How they look, how they dress, what they say, what they do, and so on. So let's look at the creation. What universal principles can we find? One thing that is universal is that everything has an external form or body made of energy. Particles, molecules, plants, animals, people, everything including you and me has a body, an external form that is made of energy. And within every being inside its external form, there is always an invisible element. We call it the internal nature. We can't see it, but the internal nature of something is that which guides it to act and move in a particular way. The particles that make up atoms and molecules all move in a particular fashion. There is an invisible internal nature that is causing that, guiding that. We commonly call this the laws of nature. Plants have living cells that are guided by invisible forces that we learn about when we study biology. And animals have animal minds that guide them, their instincts. That's how animals are able to respond to human emotion. And of course, you and me, we have an invisible mind which is guiding our actions. Everything has an internal nature and an external form. The internal nature is the cause. The external form is the result. The internal nature guides the external form or the body. What does this tell us? It tells us that the original being, God, possesses an external form that is the source of all the forms of and energy in the universe. And on the other hand, it also tells us that God possesses an internal nature that is the source of all the guiding internal natures of the universe. In other words, God possesses the original internal nature and the original external form. Let's take this a step further. If we look at the internal nature of a person, if we look at the human mind, we discover that we have a sense of identity, expressed through our intellect, emotion, and will. This would indicate that the original being, God, possesses original sense of identity, the original intellect, emotion, and will. And if we look deeper into the human mind, we discover something that is hard to define, but we call it heart. It is that part of us that seeks to love, and through that love to experience highest possible joy. It is an irrepressible desire. This also did not come from us. It has its origin in God. It means that God is actually a personal being, and this is not just a theory. Many people have actually been able to communicate with God. With your thoughts, you have the potential to sense what God is thinking. With your emotions, you have the potential to sense what God is feeling. And with your will, you are able to sense the will of God. And with your heart, you can experience God's love. Many men and women, including Jesus, and other saints in history have testified to having such direct experiences with God. Let's take another look at the universe. There is another characteristic that is universally present in all things, everything. Our eternal nature and our external form exists with masculine and feminine characteristics. Particles and molecules have positive and negative charges. A flower has male and female parts. Animals are male and female, and people exist as men and women. This would indicate that the original being possesses both masculine as well as feminine traits. God is our Heavenly Father, and God is also our Heavenly Mother. As it states in the Bible, Genesis chapter 1:27, the image of God is male and female. How then can we describe God, that original being which existed before time and space began? On one hand, God is a being of external form or energy. That is what God used to create the universe. On the other hand, God is also a being of internal nature or mind. God is a personal being with a heart, from which came the motivation to create the universe. From this perspective, we can conclude that not only can we learn about God through God's creation, but we can also learn about God from God. This is why long before we had science, there were people who, through prayer and meditation, knew about God's heart and God's will. And you also can discover God through prayer. This is why it is a good idea to pray. I suggest that as you study this material that you include time for prayer and reflection. The greatest truth is that God is a cosmic parent who initiated the work of creation because God wanted to experience the joy of loving, and for that God needed an object, children. And which of God's creation is that object he wants to love? It is that creation that is able to love God back, which of course is man and woman. But before we get into why God created us, let's first talk about how God's creation works. How are things able to exist, to move, and to grow and multiply? Let's take an example, a hydrogen atom. How does it exist? As we already mentioned, everything, including atoms, contain a masculine and feminine aspect. In this case, a proton and an electron. Because these two components are engaged in a relationship of giving and receiving, the atom is able to exist. If they were to go their own separate ways, the atom would no longer exist. The same is true for everything. How do I exist? It is because of a relationship between the dual parts that are within me. If the giving and receiving between my mind and body were to stop, or if the giving and receiving between my veins and arteries were to stop, or if the giving and receiving between my inhaling and exhaling were to stop, I would drop dead. I would no longer be able to exist. The unity between my mind and body would cease. If students and teachers in a classroom stop having give-and-receive action, you would no longer have a school. If leaders of a nation, the citizens, had no give and receive action, the nation would cease to exist. If men and women were to stop having any giving and receive action, in less than 100 years the human race would cease to exist. Now let's look closer. How are these two parts, this proton and electron, able to have this give and receive action between them? And how do they know how to move and how much to give and receive? The answer is, there is an original invisible being, God. God's internal nature, his mind, provides the design for the creation to work, and God's external form, God's energy, what we call God's universal prime force, provides the energy for the creation and for all things to engage in this giving and receiving action. We can see this original energy of God latent within every being. For example, we know it takes energy for something to move. Well, did you know that everything is moving? Nothing is sitting still. You may think some things are not moving, like this podium or your car when it runs out of gas. But in reality, everything is moving. The earth we are on is moving through space, traveling around the sun at an incredible speed. And the atoms and protons and electrons that everything is made of are moving. In fact, one day some scientists decided to try to completely prevent something from moving. And what did they discover? They found that it was impossible. This is because God's universal prime energy is in everything. Everything wants to move. Everything has to move. And so all things have these four positions. God, the origin with his energy and his heart and design, is number one. Then God, in the act of creation, divided his nature into two. These two, one representing God's masculinity, the other representing God's femininity, are number 2 and 3. We call them subject and object. And finally, when the subject and object engage in the action of giving and receiving, they make the fourth position. They unite into one, and the atom or the plant, or the person or the school or the family is able to exist. We call this a four-position foundation. The four-position foundation is a model that helps us understand how things, including people, are able to exist, grow, and multiply. Everything, without exception, exists based on this model. The four-position foundation, when it is applied to people, forms a family. You have God, man, woman, and children. This four-position foundation is the foundation by which we can fulfill the ideal of creation. This is true because the ideal of creation is about love, and the four-position foundation is what makes love possible. All the patterns of love are found here. What does it mean to be a person? It means to experience the love of a child toward God and your parents, the love of a brother or sister to your siblings, the love of a husband or wife to your spouse, and the love of a parent to your children. And because a four-position foundation is a basis for love, it is also a basis for all that is good, beautiful, and true. Goodness comes from love. You can help people, but if it is to receive a reward, we don't think of that as being good. But when you help someone because you sincerely care, because of love, then we say it is good. The four-position foundation is a foundation for beauty, because nothing is beautiful if you don't love it. And when you're in love with someone, they are the most beautiful of all. And it is a foundation for truth, because the truth also comes from love. You can know all the facts about a flower, but to really know the truth of a flower, you have to be able to love it and feel the love of God coming through it to you. And where do we experience the greatest joy? It is when we experience true love. And where does love come from? Where is it experienced? It is experienced in the family four-position foundation. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven, what people have searched for all throughout history, is actually to be found in a family where a man, a woman, and children are united in God's love. This is where we can experience the greatest joy. Now let's move on to the question of purpose. Why did God create? What is the purpose of our existence? God created through his energy, but the reason God created is that God is a being of heart. The essential desire of the heart is experienced joy. How is joy produced? We experience joy when we have an object of heart that we can love and be loved by. It is impossible to experience joy if there is no object. For example, when you were feeling down and out, did you ever try hugging yourself? Try it sometime. It doesn't work. The key to joy is the object. The more your object is able to reflect you, the more it can bring you joy. Think about it. What has the potential to bring you the most joy? A diamond, an apple tree, a dog, or another person? A person can bring us more joy because a person has a capacity to respond 100% to all aspects of our being, our intellect, our emotions, our will, and our deepest heart. This explains why God created man and woman in his image, Genesis 1:27. God made us with the ability to reflect all aspects of God's character, to reflect God 100%, God's mind and God's heart, both in their masculine and feminine expression. This is why Jesus taught in his Sermon on the Mount, John 5:48, that we are to be perfect as our Heavenly Father is perfect. Just exactly how are we to reflect God and bring God joy? How are we to love God and experience God's love? There are three ways. In the book of Genesis 1:28, God gave three blessings to the first man and woman. Be fruitful, multiply, and have dominion. We are going to look at the first of these three blessings. It will give us some insight as to how we are to love God and to be loved by God. And let's do this in terms of the structure of God's creation that we just introduced, the four-position foundation. The first blessing, to be fruitful, we interpret to mean that we are to become a true person, a mature person, whose mind and body are united, centered on God. In other words, to be a person who reflects God's nature in the way we think and the way we live our life. How do we do that? It doesn't mean you have to become some kind of super religious person. God gave every person a conscience. If, in your mind, you simply believe that you are loved by God, that you are God's child, and then connect in your mind to your conscience, you will be connected to God. That's the first step. But that is not enough. The challenging part is then to act. Live your life in accordance with the inspiration of your conscience. If you make effort to live by your conscience, if you strive to live the way a son or daughter of God would live, then you will become a person who brings great joy to God. And you will become a person who will come to sense your own value, the value that comes from knowing that you are loved by God. You will begin to experience the ideal on the individual level within yourself. Let's conclude with a brief summary of what we have covered so far. The ideal that we all seek comes from God. God is the original being that with both masculine and feminine characteristics. God possesses an external form by which the universe was made, and also God is a personal being who possesses a mind and a heart that motivated God to create the universe. All things God created are able to exist and grow and multiply when they exist in a four-position foundation and engage in relationships of giving and receiving. The reason God created is that he wanted an object to love. God is our heavenly parent. We are to be his children. How do we do that? We start as individuals by finding our conscience. that part of us that is connected to God, and then we make effort to act and live our lives according to our conscience. That is what will bring God and ourselves joy. Thank you for joining us in our study of the principles of life. In the next segment, we will look at the remaining two blessings, to multiply and have dominion. We will also explore the meaning of spiritual growth and the responsibility that God gave to each of us to be responsible for our own lives. And we will talk about the next world, the world we go to after we die. God bless you. I look forward to your participation in our next segment.